When Thomas Wilson's widow handed me a sealed envelope marked "For Father Michael only, to be opened after my death," I thought it would be another final request or spiritual reflection. As a pastor of 23 years, I believed I'd seen every kind of deathbed confession. What I discovered inside that envelope would test every sacred vow I'd ever taken. My name is Father Michael Thompson, and I have served this small Pennsylvania congregation since 1999. Our church sits on the corner of Main and Elm, a beautiful stone building that has witnessed countless baptisms, weddings, and funerals. The families here have known each other for generations, their stories intertwined like the ivy that climbs our sanctuary walls. That Thursday evening started like countless others. I had just finished visiting Mrs. Patterson in the hospital and was preparing for our weekly Bible study when Margaret Wilson knocked on my office door. Margaret, the widow of our beloved church elder Thomas Wilson, stood in the doorway with tears streaming down her weathered face. "Father Michael," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I found something in Thomas's desk. He left specific instructions." Thomas had passed away 3 days earlier after a brief battle with pneumonia. He was 72, a pillar of our community who had served on the vestry for over 2 decades. His funeral had been standing room only, filled with people whose lives he had touched through his quiet generosity and unwavering faith. Margaret approached my desk with unsteady steps, clutching a manila envelope to her chest. The envelope bore my name written in Thomas's familiar handwriting, along with words that would forever change everything. "To be opened after my death. For Father Michael only." "He made me promise," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. "He said if anything happened to him, I was to give this to you immediately. Father, I'm scared." Thomas was acting so strange these past few weeks, barely sleeping, spending hours in prayer. What could be so important that he... I accepted the envelope with trembling hands, feeling its weight, both physical and spiritual. As a priest, I had received many deathbed confessions, but never one delivered from beyond the grave. The seal was intact, and I could see Thomas had pressed it carefully, as if trying to contain something too heavy for this world. "Margaret," I said gently, "perhaps you should sit down. Let me read this first, and then we'll discuss whatever guidance the Lord provides." She nodded and settled into the worn leather chair across from my desk, the same chair where Thomas had sat just months earlier, asking me to pray for his family during what he called difficult times ahead. I had assumed he meant his failing health. With a prayer for wisdom, I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once, with Thomas's handwriting covering both sides. As I began to read, the color drained from my face. The first lines hit me like a physical blow. "Father Michael, by the time you read this, I will be standing before the judgment seat of Christ. I have carried a burden for 25 years that has nearly destroyed my soul. I can no longer bear this weight alone, and I pray that God will use you to bring justice where I have failed to find the courage." My hands began to shake as I continued reading. The confession detailed a hit-and-run accident from 1998, just 1 year before I had arrived at St. Mark's. Thomas described how he had been driving home late one evening after a church board meeting when his car struck and killed 7-year-old Emma Collins on Riverside Drive. But the horror didn't end there. The confession revealed that another man, Emma's own father, Robert Collins, had been wrongfully convicted of her death. Robert had been drinking that night and had returned home to find his daughter missing. In his intoxicated state, he had taken his car to search for her, only to discover her body on the same road. When police arrived, they found him cradling her lifeless form, his car damaged from hitting a guardrail during his frantic search. The circumstantial evidence had been overwhelming. A grieving, intoxicated father with a damaged vehicle at the scene. The prosecutor painted a picture of a man who had struck his own daughter in a drunken rage and then staged the discovery. Robert Collins was sentenced to life in prison without parole. As I read Thomas's detailed account of that night, my stomach turned. He described how he had panicked, how he had driven home in shock, how he had convinced himself that coming forward wouldn't bring Emma back. He had watched from the back of the courtroom as an innocent man was sentenced to life imprisonment. The confession went on to detail 25 years of guilt, sleepless nights, and desperate prayers for forgiveness. Thomas had tried to make amends in his own way. Anonymous donations to Robert's legal defense fund, financial support for his wife and son, even helping pay for the boy's education. But the weight of his secret had only grown heavier with each passing year. I looked up to find Margaret watching me with growing alarm. "Father, what is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." Indeed, I felt as though I had. The ghost of justice denied, of an innocent man rotting in prison, while his daughter's real killer lived as a respected member of our congregation. The ghost of a secret so devastating that it had the power to destroy multiple families and shake the very foundations of our community. "Margaret," I said carefully, "I need time to pray about this. What Thomas has shared with me, it's a matter that requires great wisdom and divine guidance." She nodded, though I could see the questions burning in her eyes. As she left my office, I remained alone with the confession, reading it again and again, hoping somehow the words might change, but they didn't. The truth remained stark and unavoidable. Robert Collins had spent 25 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, while his daughter's real killer sat in our pews every Sunday, teaching Sunday school and leading our stewardship campaigns. The moral complexity of the situation overwhelmed me. Even in death, Thomas's confession carried the weight of the confessional seal. As his pastor, was I bound to keep this secret? Yet how could I allow an innocent man to die in prison when I held the key to his freedom? I dropped to my knees beside my desk and poured out my heart to God, begging for wisdom, for guidance, for some divine intervention that might resolve this impossible situation. The rain continued to fall against the windows, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the church bell tower chiming 10 o'clock. As I knelt there in the silence, another devastating realization struck me. I knew Robert Collins' family. His son David had recently returned to our area and had been attending our young adult Bible study. Just last month, David had become engaged to Sarah Wilson, Thomas's own daughter. The irony was cruel beyond measure. The son of the man Thomas had wrongfully imprisoned was about to marry Thomas's daughter, and neither of them knew the truth that connected their families in such a horrific way. I remained on my knees until midnight, wrestling with God like Jacob at the river Jabbok. But unlike Jacob, I received no clear blessing, no divine answer to guide my path. Only the terrible weight of a secret that could destroy lives, and the growing certainty that whatever I decided to do next would change everything forever. What happened next would test every principle I held sacred and force me to choose between the letter of church law and the spirit of divine justice. The revelation I was about to uncover would shake our entire community to its core. And the decision I would ultimately make would haunt me for the rest of my ministry. But nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered when I started digging deeper into Thomas's confession. What I found will absolutely blow your mind, and the way this story resolves will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about justice, forgiveness, and the power of truth. I spent that sleepless night walking the halls of our church, seeking God's wisdom in the familiar shadows of His house. The sanctuary felt different now, heavy with the weight of secrets that seemed to seep from the very walls. As dawn broke through the stained glass windows, I found myself kneeling at the altar rail where Thomas Wilson had received communion just weeks before his death. My journey to this moment began 24 years ago when I first felt the Lord's call to ministry. I was fresh out of seminary, filled with idealistic dreams of shepherding souls and bringing God's love to a hurting world. How naive I had been to think that serving Christ would be a simple matter of preaching on Sundays and visiting the sick. St. Mark's was my first and only parish assignment. When I arrived in 1999, the congregation was struggling with declining membership and financial difficulties. The previous rector had left under difficult circumstances, and the remaining parishioners were hungry for spiritual leadership they could trust. Thomas Wilson was among the first to welcome me, shaking my hand after my initial sermon and saying, "Father, I believe God has sent you to heal our community. Over the years, I had watched Thomas transform from a quiet, somewhat withdrawn man into one of our most active leaders. He threw himself into church work with an intensity that sometimes concerned me. He rarely missed a service, volunteered for every committee, and gave generously to every cause. Now I understood the desperate motivation behind his devotion. He was trying to earn forgiveness for an unconfessable sin. The Wilson family had been part of St. Mark's for 3 generations. Thomas's father, William, had helped build our current sanctuary in 1967. Their family pew was third from the front on the right side, and their nameplate on the memorial wall honored multiple generations of faithful service. Thomas's daughter, Sarah, had been baptized in our font, confirmed at our altar, and was now planning to be married in our sanctuary. Sarah Wilson was a beautiful young woman with her father's gentle eyes and her mother's warm smile. She worked as a pediatric nurse at the county hospital and had recently begun bringing her fiancé, David Collins, to our services. David was a quiet, thoughtful man who carried himself with the dignity of someone who had faced great hardship. He worked construction during the day and attended night classes in social work, hoping to help other families affected by the criminal justice system. The cruel irony of their love story now struck me with devastating clarity. David had grown up believing his father was a monster, struggling with the shame and stigma of having a parent in prison for such a horrific crime. Yet he had somehow found the strength to build a good life, to fall in love, and to maintain hope for the future. How would he react to learning that his father had been innocent all along? And how would Sarah bear the knowledge that her own father had been responsible for the tragedy that had shaped her beloved's entire life? I remembered the evening just 2 months ago when David had approached me after Bible study. "Father Michael," he had said, his voice heavy with emotion, "I need to ask you something. Sarah and I are getting married next spring, and I want to start our life together with a clean slate. I've been carrying anger toward my father for 25 years. I know what he did was terrible, but he's still my father. How do I forgive him while still honoring his victim?" I had counseled him about the nature of forgiveness, quoting Jesus' words about forgiving 70 times 7. We had prayed together, and I had watched a peace settle over his features as he chose to release his bitterness. Now, knowing what I knew, that conversation felt like a mockery. The Collins family's story was well known in our community. Robert Collins had once been a respected electrician with his own small business. His wife, Linda, had been a school teacher beloved by her students. Their daughter, Emma, had been their only child, born after years of struggling with infertility. The night she died, their entire world had collapsed. Linda Collins had never remarried. She had struggled with depression and health problems for years, working minimum wage jobs to make ends meet while her husband sat in prison. David had essentially raised himself, becoming the man of the house at age 12. Despite the overwhelming challenges, he had graduated high school with honors and had worked his way through community college. I had met Linda only once at a community interfaith service several years ago. She was a broken woman, aged beyond her years, who spoke of praying daily for the strength to forgive her husband for what he had done to their family. The knowledge that she had been praying to forgive an innocent man made my heart ache. As I sat in my study the next morning, Thomas's confession spread before me. I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about justice and mercy. The Bible speaks clearly about the importance of truth. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Yet it also teaches us about the sacred nature of confession and the seal of pastoral confidentiality. I had always believed that the confessional seal was inviolable. In 23 years of ministry, I had kept countless secrets: affairs, addictions, financial improprieties, family violence. Some had been difficult to bear, but I had never before faced a situation where my silence might perpetuate such a grave injustice. The weight of Robert Collins's 25 years of imprisonment pressed down on me like a physical force. I tried to imagine what it would be like to sit in a cell year after year, knowing you were innocent but unable to prove it, How many nights had he lain awake, wondering if his son believed in his innocence? How many times had he replayed that terrible evening, wishing he had never left the house to search for Emma? I pulled out my Bible and turned to the story of David and Nathan, where the prophet confronted the king about his sin. Sometimes God uses human instruments to bring hidden truths to light. But Nathan had been commanded by God to speak. I had received no such divine directive, only the terrible knowledge contained in a dead man's confession. Margaret Wilson called that afternoon, her voice strained with worry. "Father, I barely slept last night. Thomas's behavior these past few weeks makes so much more sense now. He kept talking about making things right, about justice being served. What could he have possibly done that was so terrible?" I chose my words carefully. "Margaret, your husband was a good man who was struggling with something very difficult. I'm still praying about the best way to honor his wishes while serving God's will. I need you to trust me and be patient while I seek guidance." "But Father," she pressed, "if there's something that could help someone or prevent harm, surely we have an obligation to act. Thomas always said that the truth has a way of coming to light, that God won't let injustice prevail forever." Her words struck me like lightning. Thomas had been trying to tell me something, even in death. Perhaps his confession wasn't meant to be another secret for me to bear, but rather a tool for bringing justice to light. Maybe he had been too weak to act while he lived, but he had found the courage to set truth in motion through his death. That evening, I drove past the Collins family's modest rental house on the outskirts of town. The yard was well maintained despite their financial struggles, and I could see David's truck in the driveway. A light was on in what I assumed was the kitchen, and I imagined him and Linda having dinner together, perhaps discussing his upcoming wedding or his father's failing health. The irony was overwhelming. In just a few months, David would marry into the family responsible for his father's imprisonment. Sarah Wilson would become Sarah Collins, taking the name of the man her father had wrongfully condemned. Their children would carry the genetic legacy of both victim and perpetrator, never knowing the truth that connected their bloodlines. As I sat in my car watching that little house, I felt the presence of the Holy Spirit stirring within me. Sometimes God's justice requires human instruments. Sometimes the truth demands to be spoken, even when it costs us everything we hold dear. But what I was about to discover about Robert Collins's current situation would change everything and force me to make a decision that would either save a life or destroy everything I held sacred. The next revelation would test my faith like never before and prove that God's timing is always perfect, even when it feels like a race against death itself. The following Sunday arrived with the crisp clarity that only autumn can bring. As I prepared for morning worship, Thomas's confession weighed heavily on my mind. I had read it dozens of times, searching for some detail I might have missed, some clue that might guide my path forward. What I discovered during that service would reveal just how deep this tragedy had penetrated our community. Standing at the pulpit, I looked out over familiar faces with new eyes. There sat Margaret Wilson in her customary third pew, her face still etched with grief, but showing the beginning signs of healing. Beside her sat Sarah, radiant with the joy of an upcoming bride, completely unaware that her happiness was built on a foundation of lies. 3 rows behind them, I spotted someone I hadn't expected to see. Linda Collins sat quietly in the back corner, her thin frame almost lost in the shadows. She rarely attended church anymore, but something had drawn her here today. Our eyes met briefly, and I saw in her gaze the deep weariness of a woman who had carried an impossible burden for 25 years. As I began my sermon on forgiveness, a message I had prepared weeks earlier but now felt divinely appointed, I watched Linda's reaction. When I spoke about releasing bitterness and trusting in God's justice, tears began streaming down her cheeks. She clutched a worn photo in her hands, and I realized with a shock that it was a picture of little Emma. Sometimes, I found myself saying, the words coming from somewhere deeper than my prepared notes, God's justice takes longer than we expect. Sometimes the truth is hidden for a season, but the Lord promises that what is done in darkness will eventually come to light. I hadn't planned those words, but they seemed to flow directly from my heart to my lips. Linda looked up sharply, as if my message had been meant specifically for her. After the service, she approached me with trembling hands. "Father Michael," she whispered, "I don't know why I came today. I haven't been to church in months, but something told me I needed to be here. Your words about truth coming to light. Do you think God might still have justice in store for my Emma?" My throat constricted. Here was a mother still hoping for justice for her murdered child, while the real perpetrator's family sat just a few pews away. "Linda," I managed, "God sees everything, every injustice, every hidden thing. His timing isn't always our timing, but His justice is perfect." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I've been praying for 25 years that Robert would tell me the truth about that night. I love him, Father, but I need to understand what happened to my baby. The story never made sense to me, but everyone said the evidence was clear." Her words hit me like a physical blow. Even Emma's own mother had doubts about her husband's guilt. How many others had quietly questioned the official story over the years? As the congregation filed out, I noticed Margaret Wilson lingering near the memorial wall where her family's nameplate hung prominently. She was speaking quietly with Mrs. Henderson, one of our oldest members, and I caught fragments of their conversation that made my blood run cold. "Icky always wondered about that night," Mrs. Henderson was saying. "Thomas came to the church board meeting, but he left early, said he wasn't feeling well. Then, the next morning, he had that big dent in his front bumper, said he hit a deer." Margaret's face had gone pale. "A deer? But, Mother, that was the same night that little girl was—" Oh my goodness. I quickly approached them, my heart pounding. "Ladies, how are you both doing today?" Mrs. Henderson looked at me with troubled eyes. "Father, Margaret and I were just talking about that terrible night when Emma Collins died. I've always had questions about it, things that didn't quite add up. But after all these years, I suppose it doesn't matter." "What kind of questions?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Well," she continued, "I remember the police questioning everyone who had been out driving that night. They talked to several of us church members since we'd all been at the meeting. But Thomas never mentioned hitting anything, even though his car was clearly damaged the next day. At the time, I just assumed he was embarrassed about the deer incident." Margaret gripped my arm. "Father, you don't think— Surely there's no connection." I chose my words carefully. Sometimes traumatic events affect our memories. People cope with shock in different ways. We should be careful not to judge past actions without understanding the full picture. But even as I spoke those words, I could see the seed of doubt taking root in Margaret's mind. She knew her husband better than anyone. She had lived with his guilt, his sleepless nights, his desperate attempts to atone for something unspoken. Later that afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. David Collins knocked on my office door, his usual calm demeanor replaced by obvious distress. "Father Michael, I need to talk to someone. I just visited my father in prison, and he told me something that's been eating at me all day." I invited him to sit, my hands trembling slightly as I poured him a cup of coffee. "Dad's not doing well," David continued. "The doctors say he might only have a few months left. But here's the thing. He's been maintaining his innocence for 25 years, and yesterday he looked me in the eyes and said something that shook me to my core." David paused, running his hands through his hair. He said, "Son, I know you've tried to forgive me for what everyone thinks I did, but I need you to know that when I meet my Maker, I'll be able to say, I never hurt that little girl. Someone else did, and someday the truth will come out." The irony was devastating. A dying man proclaiming his innocence while his daughter's real killer had just been buried with full honors in our churchyard. "Father," David continued, "what if he's telling the truth? What if my father has been innocent all these years? How do I live with that? How do I tell Sarah that I might have been wrong about everything?" I struggled to maintain my composure. "David, these are heavy questions. Sometimes we have to trust that God sees the whole picture, even when we can't. Have you shared these concerns with Sarah?" "That's the problem," he said. "Sarah's been so understanding about my family situation. She's even suggested we might use some of her inheritance to hire a new lawyer for Dad. Can you imagine the irony if her own family money ended up proving my father's innocence? The walls of my office seemed to be closing in around me. Sarah Wilson's inheritance, money that came from Thomas Wilson's estate, being used to exonerate the man Thomas had wrongfully imprisoned. The divine justice in that scenario was both beautiful and terrifying. That evening, I walked through our church cemetery, stopping at Thomas's fresh grave. The headstone read, Thomas William Wilson, 1950-2023, faithful servant of God. Below that, a Bible verse, the truth shall set you free. Even in death, Thomas seemed to be calling for honesty. Had he chosen that verse deliberately, knowing that his confession would eventually lead to the truth? As I stood there in the gathering darkness, I heard footsteps behind me. Margaret Wilson approached, carrying a small bouquet of flowers for her husband's grave. "Father," she said quietly, "I've been thinking about what Mrs. Henderson said today, about the damage to Thomas's car that night. I remember now. He never did explain it properly. And there's something else." She knelt beside the grave, her voice barely above a whisper. The night Emma Collins died, Thomas came home very late. He was shaken up, almost in shock. He showered immediately and put his clothes directly in the washing machine. I thought it was strange, but he said he'd been sick at the meeting and wanted to clean up. Margaret looked up at me with growing realization in her eyes. "Father, the confession you read, it's about that night, isn't it? Thomas was involved in Emma's death somehow." I couldn't speak. The truth was unraveling itself, thread by thread, and I was powerless to stop it. "That innocent man has been in prison all these years," she continued, her voice breaking. "And my husband, my dear husband, was carrying this terrible secret. Father, we have to tell someone. We have to make this right." But what Margaret didn't know was that the situation was far more complicated than she could imagine, and the decision I was about to make would either bring justice to a dying man or shatter the lives of everyone we loved. The revelation that was coming would test the very foundations of our faith and prove that sometimes doing God's will requires us to break every rule we hold sacred. The following week brought a crisis that would force my hand in ways I never could have imagined. It began with a phone call from Sarah Wilson at 6 a.m, her voice breaking with panic. "Father Michael, please come quickly. David collapsed last night and they rushed him to the hospital. The doctors are asking about his family medical history, and there's something terribly wrong. They need to know about genetic conditions, but David doesn't know anything about his real father's medical background because—" She didn't need to finish. Because David believed his father was a murderer who had destroyed their family, cutting off all communication and medical information that could now save his life. I arrived at the county hospital to find Sarah pacing the waiting room, her engagement ring catching the harsh fluorescent lights as she wrung her hands. David was in the ICU, having suffered what doctors suspected was a rare genetic cardiac condition that could be fatal without immediate family history and proper treatment. "The cardiologist says there are several genetic markers they need to test for," Sarah explained through tears. "Some require knowing the father's medical background going back generations. David always refused to have any contact with his father, and now, Father, what if his pride costs him his life?" The cruel irony was devastating. David was potentially dying because he had no access to his father's medical history. The same father who sat innocent in prison, probably carrying the very genetic information that could save his son's life. Dr. Martinez, the attending cardiologist, approached us with a grim expression. "I need to be direct with you. Your fiancé has a condition called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. It's often hereditary, and knowing his father's cardiac history could be the difference between life and death in choosing the right treatment protocol." Sarah looked at me desperately. "Father, I know David's proud, but surely God wouldn't want him to die because of family stubbornness. Could you talk to him? Maybe convince him to reach out to his father just this once?" My throat felt like sandpaper. How could I tell her that Robert Collins would gladly share his medical history, but that the real genetic information David needed might be locked away in Thomas Wilson's family medical records, records that Sarah had every right to access as his daughter? That afternoon, I found myself in the most agonizing position of my entire ministry. I sat at David's bedside, watching this young man struggle for breath, knowing that the answers to his medical crisis might lie in the very confession that had tormented me for days. "Father," David whispered weakly, "Sarah thinks I should contact my father's family for medical information, but I can't. I won't have anything to do with a man who destroyed so many lives, even if it costs me everything." The weight of Robert Collins's innocence pressed down on me like a physical force. Here was a son rejecting his father's help, not knowing that his father was innocent and would move heaven and earth to save him. That evening, I made a decision that would haunt me forever. I called Margaret Wilson and asked her to meet me at the church. When she arrived, her face drawn with worry over David's condition, I knew I had to find a way to help without breaking my sacred vows. "Margaret," I said carefully, "I need you to think very hard about Thomas's family medical history, specifically any heart conditions that might run in your family line." Her eyes widened. "Father, why would you—" "Oh my goodness, David's heart condition. You think there might be a connection to our family?" I couldn't answer directly, but I could see the understanding dawning in her eyes. "Father," she whispered, "the confession you read, it wasn't just about that night, was it? There are other connections, other consequences we never imagined." The next morning brought another devastating development. Linda Collins appeared at my office, her face etched with desperation. "Father Michael, I heard about David's condition. I know he wants nothing to do with his father, but Robert is beside himself with worry. He's been trying to get the prison medical staff to send his family's cardiac history to the hospital, but David has blocked all communication from the prison." She clutched a manila envelope to her chest. "This contains 4 generations of Collins family medical records. Robert's grandfather died of the same condition David has. There are treatments, genetic markers, things the doctors need to know, but David won't accept anything from his father." The irony was suffocating. A son was dying while rejecting help from an innocent father, and the real genetic information he needed was sitting in the family records of the man who had wrongfully imprisoned his father. That Sunday, I preached what would become the most difficult sermon of my career. Standing before my congregation, with Margaret Wilson in her usual pew and an empty space where Sarah sat keeping vigil at David's bedside, I spoke about the parable of the unmerciful servant. "Sometimes," I heard myself saying, "we hold on to anger and unforgiveness, not knowing that our very survival depends on releasing those burdens. Sometimes God's mercy comes through the people we least expect, even those we believe have wronged us." The congregation listened intently, unaware that every word was directed at a specific crisis unfolding in their midst. That afternoon, I received a call that would change everything. Bishop Henderson, my superior, was calling to discuss what he described as a delicate matter involving pastoral confidentiality. "Michael," he said, his voice heavy with concern, "I've received some unusual inquiries about a case from 1998. Something about new evidence in the Emma Collins murder case. I need to ask you directly, has anyone approached you with information about this matter?" My heart stopped. Someone else was investigating. The truth was beginning to surface through channels I couldn't control. "Bishop," I said carefully, "I'm bound by the seal of confession in ways that make this conversation very difficult." There was a long pause. "Michael, I understand the sacred nature of the confessional seal, but if you have information that could prevent a miscarriage of justice or save a life, we need to discuss the theological and ethical implications. Can you come to see me tomorrow?" That night, as I knelt in the empty sanctuary, I felt the weight of multiple lives hanging in the balance. David Collins lay dying in the hospital, possibly needing genetic information from the very family that had destroyed his life. Robert Collins sat innocent in prison, desperate to save his son, but powerless to reach him. Margaret Wilson was beginning to piece together the truth about her husband's secret. And somewhere in the darkness, forces beyond my control were beginning to investigate the Emma Collins case. I had spent days wrestling with the question of whether I should break the seal of confession. Now I realized that the choice might be taken away from me entirely. The truth had a way of surfacing on its own, just as Thomas had predicted. As I sat in that sanctuary, surrounded by the stained glass windows that had witnessed a quarter-century of secrets and lies, I finally understood what Thomas Wilson had been trying to tell me. His confession wasn't meant to be another burden for me to carry in silence. It was meant to be the key that would unlock a prison of lies and set multiple families free. But what I discovered when I met with the bishop the next morning would reveal that the situation was far more complex than I ever imagined, and the choice I thought I had to make was about to be made for me in a way that would shake our entire community to its foundation. The revelation waiting for me would prove that sometimes God's justice works in ways that are both terrifying and beautiful beyond our understanding. My meeting with Bishop Henderson the next morning would prove to be the catalyst that changed everything. I arrived at the diocesan office with Thomas's confession weighing heavily in my briefcase, still uncertain about how much I could reveal without violating sacred vows. "Michael," the bishop began, his weathered face showing deep concern, "I received a call from the State Attorney General's office. They're reopening the Emma Collins case based on new DNA evidence and witness testimonies that have emerged. They specifically mentioned that several church members from St. Mark's have come forward with information about inconsistencies from that night in 1998. My blood ran cold. The investigation was moving forward with or without my involvement. "There's more," Bishop Henderson continued. "Robert Collins is dying. The prison doctors give him perhaps 2 weeks. His son David is also in critical condition, and there are questions about genetic medical history that could save his life. Michael, if you know anything at all, that could help either of these men, we need to discuss the pastoral and ethical implications immediately." I sat in stunned silence as the bishop continued. "The Attorney General has asked for our cooperation in reviewing any parish records, communications, or information that might be relevant. They have reason to believe that someone in our congregation may have knowledge about what really happened that night." "Bishop," I said carefully, "if someone had approached me in the context of sacramental confession—" "I understand completely," he interrupted. "But Michael, the seal of confession has never been intended to protect ongoing harm to innocent people. If Robert Collins dies in prison for a crime he didn't commit, and his son dies because of family estrangement based on a lie, we have to ask ourselves, what would Christ do?" That afternoon I returned to find chaos at the hospital. David's condition had worsened dramatically, and the doctors were preparing to perform emergency surgery without the crucial family medical history they needed. Sarah met me in the hallway, her face streaked with tears. "Father, the doctors say they have to operate now or lose him completely, but they're going in blind because David still refuses any contact with his father's family. I've been praying, but I don't understand why God would let this happen." Dr. Martinez approached us with urgent news. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but we've discovered something unusual in David's blood work. His genetic markers don't match the patterns we'd expect based on his supposed paternal lineage. We need to expand our search for family medical history beyond what we initially thought." My heart stopped. The genetic testing was revealing what I already knew. David's real father wasn't Robert Collins. That evening brought the most devastating development yet. Margaret Wilson called me in absolute panic. "Father Michael, the police just left my house. They had a search warrant for Thomas's car records, insurance claims, everything from 1998. They asked me specifically about damage to his vehicle and whether he ever mentioned hitting anything that night. Father, they know something, don't they? About Thomas and that poor little girl?" I could hear her breaking down over the phone. "They also asked about David Collins and whether Thomas ever showed unusual interest in his family. Father, if my husband was involved in Emma's death, and if David is somehow— oh my God, are you saying that David might be—" The truth was unraveling faster than I could control. Margaret was beginning to understand not just that her husband had killed Emma Collins, but that David Collins might be Thomas's biological son, the result of an affair that had preceded the fatal accident by several years. I spent that night in the sanctuary, prostrate before the altar, wrestling with God like Jacob at Peniel. The weight of multiple lives hung in the balance. Robert Collins dying innocent in prison, David Collins dying from lack of proper medical history, Margaret Wilson discovering her husband's double betrayal, and Sarah Wilson about to learn that her fiancé was actually her half-brother. As dawn broke through the stained glass windows, I felt a peace that surpassed understanding wash over me. Sometimes God's justice requires human instruments. Sometimes the greater good demands that we risk everything we hold dear. I picked up my phone and dialed the Attorney General's office. "This is Father Michael Thompson from St. Mark's Episcopal Church. I believe I have information relevant to the Emma Collins case and the medical emergency involving David Collins. I need to speak with someone immediately about the pastoral and legal implications of what I'm about to share." The voice on the other end was alert and professional. "Father Thompson, we've been hoping you would call. Can you come in this morning? We have specialists standing by who understand the complexities of clerical confidentiality." As I prepared to leave the church, my phone rang. It was the hospital. "Father Thompson, this is Dr. Martinez. I'm calling because David Collins has taken a turn for the worse. We need to operate within the hour, but we've discovered something in his genetic testing that doesn't make sense. His DNA shows markers that suggest his biological father isn't who we thought. We need accurate family medical history immediately, or we could lose him." I looked up at the cross hanging above our altar, the same cross that had witnessed Thomas Wilson's communion just weeks before his death. Sometimes the truth demands to be spoken, even when it costs us everything. "Doctor," I said, my voice steady for the first time in days, "I believe I can help you get the medical information you need, but I need 1 hour to make some calls and arrange for the proper legal and pastoral protocols." As I walked toward my car, Margaret Wilson was standing by the church entrance, her face showing she had made her own decision. "Father," she said quietly, "I've been up all night thinking and praying. If Thomas did what I think he did, and if David is who I think he is, then we have to tell the truth. I can't let an innocent man die in prison, and I can't let David die because of our family's secrets." She handed me a thick manila envelope. "These are Thomas's complete medical records going back 3 generations. Every heart condition, every genetic marker, everything the doctors need to save David's life. And Father, I've already called the police. I told them I want to cooperate fully with their investigation." But what happened when the DNA results came back and the full truth about the Collins and Wilson families was revealed would shock everyone involved and prove that God's justice sometimes works in ways that are more complex and beautiful than any human mind could imagine. The revelation that was about to unfold would not only free an innocent man and save a life, but would also unite 2 families in a way that would restore faith in divine providence itself. The truth exploded into the open with a force that no one could have anticipated. Within hours of my meeting with the Attorney General's office and Margaret's decision to cooperate, the carefully constructed lies of 25 years began crumbling like a house built on sand. It started at the hospital. Dr. Martinez called me just after noon, his voice filled with amazement and confusion. "Father Thompson, I need you to come to the hospital immediately. The genetic testing on David Collins has revealed something extraordinary. Not only is Robert Collins not his biological father, but the DNA markers suggest his real father was someone with a very specific genetic profile, someone whose family medical history we actually have on file." When I arrived, the medical team was in a state of controlled chaos. The genetic counselor, Dr. Sarah Kim, met me in the consultation room with printouts that would change everything. "Father, when we ran David's DNA through our database, looking for genetic matches that might help with his cardiac condition, we found a match with samples we had on file from another family. Thomas Wilson's family provided genetic samples 3 years ago when his own father was being treated for heart disease. David Collins is genetically a Wilson, not a Collins." The implications hit the room like a thunderbolt. David Collins was Thomas Wilson's biological son, making him Sarah's half-brother. The young man fighting for his life was genetically entitled to the very medical history that could save him. Dr. Martinez immediately put together an emergency treatment plan based on the Wilson family cardiac history. With this information, we can perform a targeted genetic therapy that has an 80% success rate for this specific condition. Without it, his chances were less than 30%. As David was being prepared for the life-saving procedure, I realized that God's providence had used the medical crisis to reveal the deeper truth. The very emergency that threatened his life had become the key to unlocking his genetic identity. Meanwhile, the police investigation was moving with startling speed. Detective Rodriguez called me at the hospital with news that would shake our entire community. Father Thompson, based on the information provided by Mrs. Wilson and your cooperation with our investigation, we've obtained search warrants for the Wilson property. What we found goes beyond just the Emma Collins case. They had discovered Thomas's private office in the basement of his home containing detailed records that Margaret had never known existed. Hidden behind a false wall were journals, photographs, and documentation of his affair with Linda Collins that had produced David. More devastating still were records showing that Thomas had been systematically providing anonymous financial support to the Collins family for 25 years, guilt money for his double betrayal. Father, Detective Rodriguez continued, there's evidence that Thomas Wilson knew exactly who David Collins was. He watched that boy grow up, knew he was his biological son, and still allowed Robert Collins to remain in prison for a crime Thomas committed. The psychological profile suggests he was living in his own personal hell. The afternoon brought the most dramatic moment of all. Linda Collins, David's mother, was brought to the hospital for questioning. When detectives revealed the genetic evidence and showed her excerpts from Thomas's hidden journals, she collapsed in the hospital corridor. "I knew," she whispered through her tears. "Deep down, I always knew Robert didn't hurt Emma. But Thomas convinced me that staying quiet was better for David, better for everyone. He said if the truth came out about our affair, it would destroy David's future, make him a scandal in this small town." The revelation shattered my understanding of the case. Linda Collins had known about the affair and suspected Thomas's involvement in Emma's death, but had remained silent to protect her son's reputation. She had allowed her innocent husband to rot in prison while raising Thomas's child with Thomas's secret financial support. Thomas told me that Robert would be released eventually, that the evidence wasn't that strong, Linda continued. He said we just needed to wait for things to calm down. But years kept passing, and then it became easier to just keep quiet. The news spread through our small community like wildfire. By evening, word had reached everyone. Thomas Wilson, respected church elder and pillar of the community, had been living a double life. He had killed Emma Collins in a hit-and-run accident, allowed an innocent man to be imprisoned for the crime, and had secretly fathered that man's son through an extramarital affair. The parish phone rang constantly. Members of our congregation were in shock, unable to process how someone they had trusted and respected for decades could have harbored such devastating secrets. Margaret Wilson bore the brunt of the community's reaction with remarkable grace. When I visited her that evening, I found her surrounded by boxes, packing Thomas's belongings. "Father," she said quietly, "I keep asking myself how I lived with this man for 30 years and never saw the truth. The signs were all there, his obsessive charity work, his sleepless nights, his desperate need to help everyone. He was trying to earn forgiveness for something he could never confess." Sarah Wilson's reaction was perhaps the most heartbreaking. When she learned that David was her half-brother, that their love story was built on a foundation of lies and tragedy, she went into emotional shock. "How do I process this, Father?" she asked me through tears. "The man I love is my brother. My father killed his sister and destroyed his family. How do we even begin to heal from something like this?" The evening news carried the story as breaking headlines. Local church elders' posthumous confession solves 25-year-old murder case. The reporter stood outside St. Mark's, explaining how a deathbed confession had led to the exoneration of an innocent man and revealed a web of family secrets that had destroyed multiple lives. That night, I called an emergency parish meeting. Our sanctuary was packed with members trying to understand how their trusted leader could have lived such a lie. Some were angry, feeling betrayed by Thomas's deception. Others expressed compassion for the impossible burden he had carried. Many were simply confused and hurt. "Friends," I addressed the gathered congregation, "we are facing a crisis of faith and community. A man we trusted and loved was carrying secrets that consumed his soul. Tonight, we must choose between judgment and mercy, between division and healing." The meeting lasted until nearly midnight, with members sharing their shock, anger, and confusion. But gradually, a consensus emerged. Our community needed to focus on supporting the victims of Thomas's choices and finding a way to heal the wounds his secrets had created. As I locked the church that night, I reflected on how truth had indeed set people free, just as Jesus promised. Robert Collins would finally be exonerated. David Collins would receive the medical treatment he needed. The genetic truth would be revealed. But the price of that freedom was higher than anyone could have imagined. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. What the police discovered in Thomas Wilson's final hidden documents would expose a truth so devastating that it would force everyone to question everything they thought they knew about love, sacrifice, and the lengths one man would go to protect the people he cared about most. The ultimate truth would prove that sometimes the greatest acts of love require the greatest acts of sacrifice. 6 months after that life-changing confession was revealed, I stood at the altar of St. Mark's, preparing for what would become the most meaningful service of my 24 years in ministry. The final revelation from Thomas Wilson's hidden documents had indeed shaken everyone to their core, but not in the way we expected. The police had discovered Thomas's real reason for maintaining his silence all those years. Hidden in his private safe was a letter addressed to Robert Collins, written just days before Thomas's death, but never sent. In it, Thomas revealed that he had hired private investigators to monitor Robert's case for decades. He had discovered that Robert Collins was suffering from early-stage dementia and would likely not survive the trauma of learning the full truth about Emma's death and David's parentage. Thomas had been trapped in an impossible situation. Revealing the truth would have freed an innocent man, but potentially killed him with the shock of learning that his wife had betrayed him and his son wasn't actually his child. Thomas chose to carry the burden alone until his death, believing it was the more merciful path. The revelation changed everything. Robert Collins was quietly released from prison and brought to a specialized care facility where he could spend his remaining time in dignity. The dementia had progressed enough that he accepted the explanation that new evidence had cleared his name without fully comprehending the complex family dynamics involved. In his lucid moments, he spoke of forgiveness and gratitude for finally being able to see the sky again. David Collins recovered fully from his cardiac surgery. The Wilson family medical history had provided exactly what the doctors needed. More remarkably, David chose to keep the Collins name, saying that Robert had been his real father in every way that mattered. "Love makes a family," he told me, "not just genetics." The relationship between David and Sarah naturally evolved from romantic love to something deeper, the profound bond of siblings who had found each other through tragedy. Sarah called off their engagement, but they remained inseparable as brother and sister. She moved into David's apartment to help care for Robert during his final months, and their relationship became a beautiful testament to the different forms love can take. Margaret Wilson surprised everyone with her response to the crisis. Rather than retreating in shame, she became the driving force behind the community's healing process. She sold the family home and used the proceeds to establish the Emma Collins Memorial Foundation, providing support for families affected by wrongful imprisonment and genetic medical conditions. Thomas spent 25 years trying to earn forgiveness in secret, she told me. I'm going to spend whatever years I have left earning it in the open. Linda Collins underwent the most dramatic transformation of all. The weight of her 25-year silence had nearly destroyed her, but confession brought an unexpected peace. She joined Margaret in running the foundation and became a powerful advocate for families facing impossible moral choices. "I thought I was protecting David by staying quiet," she explained to our congregation during one of our healing circles. "But I was really protecting myself from facing the truth. Sometimes the greatest act of love is the hardest thing to do." The community's response restored my faith in human nature. Instead of fragmenting under the weight of scandal, our congregation grew stronger. Members who had never spoken to each other before began forming deep friendships through their shared experience of trauma and healing. Bible study groups sprang up organically, focusing on themes of forgiveness, redemption, and the complex nature of moral choices. Today's service was special because Robert Collins had asked to attend. Though his dementia was progressing, he had moments of clarity where he understood that he was free and that his son was healthy. David wheeled him to the front pew, where Margaret and Sarah were waiting with Linda. As I looked out over the congregation, I saw how God had worked through this tragedy to create something beautiful. Families that had been destroyed by lies were now united by truth. Children who had grown up with secrets were now free to love openly. A community that had been built on unspoken shame was now founded on radical forgiveness. "Friends," I began my sermon, 6 months ago, we faced a crisis that could have destroyed us. We learned that someone we trusted had been carrying devastating secrets. We discovered that families we thought we knew were not what they seemed. We were forced to confront the reality that sometimes good people make terrible choices, and sometimes those choices have consequences that last for generations. I paused, looking at the faces before me, faces that had been marked by shock and pain, but were now showing signs of peace and wisdom. But we also learned something else. We learned that truth, no matter how painful, really does set us free. We learned that love, real love, is stronger than genetics, stronger than scandal, stronger than shame. We learned that forgiveness is not just a nice idea we talk about on Sundays, but a radical force that can transform lives and communities. After the service, something extraordinary happened. Robert Collins, in one of his clear moments, asked to speak to the congregation. David helped him to the front of the sanctuary, where this gentleman who had spent 25 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit stood before the people who now knew his story. "I don't understand everything that happened," he said in a voice barely above a whisper, "but I understand this. God never abandoned me. Even in the darkest places, His love found me. And now, surrounded by all of you, I can say that even the suffering was worth it if it brought us to this moment of love and truth." There wasn't a dry eye in the sanctuary. This man who had every right to be bitter had chosen grace. This victim who could have demanded justice had chosen mercy. As the congregation slowly filed out, I noticed that the usual social divisions had dissolved. Wealthy families were embracing working-class members. Lifelong residents were welcoming newcomers. The crisis had stripped away pretense and revealed our shared humanity. Margaret Wilson approached me as I was removing my vestments. "Father Michael," she said, "I have a question for you. Do you think Thomas is at peace now? Do you think God has forgiven him?" I thought carefully before answering. "Margaret, I believe that God's mercy is bigger than our understanding. Thomas carried a terrible burden, but he also lived with genuine remorse. He spent 25 years trying to make amends, even if he did it imperfectly. The foundation you've created in his memory, the healing that has come from his confession, the lives that have been saved and families that have been reunited, perhaps this was all part of God's plan from the beginning." As I locked the church that evening, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. The confession that had seemed like a burden had become a gift. The truth that had threatened to destroy us had instead transformed us. The scandal that could have scattered our flock had instead drawn us closer together. 6 months later, David Collins married a wonderful woman he met through the foundation, a fellow advocate for criminal justice reform. Sarah Wilson became a genetic counselor, using her experience to help other families navigate complex medical and ethical situations. Margaret and Linda continued their work together, becoming unlikely best friends united by their shared commitment to helping others. And Robert Collins passed away peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by the family that love had created, not the family that genetics had determined, but the family that choice and commitment had built. The confession that started this journey had asked a simple question: what is our greatest obligation, to keep secrets or to seek justice? Through our community's response, we learned that the answer is neither. Our greatest obligation is to love, with wisdom, with courage, and with the faith that God can bring beauty from even the most broken situations. Today, whenever someone asks me about the limits of pastoral confidentiality or the nature of divine justice, I tell them about Thomas Wilson's confession and the extraordinary grace that followed. Truth may be painful, but it is also liberating. Forgiveness may be difficult, but it is also transformative. And love, real, sacrificial, unconditional love, really can conquer all. In the end, we discovered that God's greatest miracles don't always look like what we expect. Sometimes they look like a wrongfully imprisoned man choosing forgiveness over bitterness. Sometimes they look like a community choosing unity over division, and sometimes they look like families built not on blood, but on the unshakable foundation of love, truth, and grace.